no longer be ignored or kept in his place. His fight with the females took on a life of its own, quite separate from the struggle high up in the trees. It sometimes happened that Nikki and the females were still at odds long after the conflict between Yerowan and Lewitt had ended. Sometimes, however, Nikki seemed deliberately to come to Lewitt's aid. On one such occasion he chased Mama away from Yerowan's side, drove her into one of the small dead trees, and stayed at the bottom of the tree displaying until Lewitt and Yerowan had finished quarreling. Then, and only then, was Mama allowed to descend. Conversely, Lewitt supported Nikki in his gigantic struggle against the females. On the rare occasions that Nikki found himself in trouble, either Lewitt or Pewist would rally to his rescue. Here again Pewist's role was strangely unfeminine. While all the other females were displaying their solidarity in attacking Nikki, Pewist would be the odd one out, siding with the wrong side. Her special relationship with Nikki, like Lewitt's relationship with Nikki, was a mutual one. Nikki's aggressive actions were never directed against Pewist, and she was the only female who could count on his support if she herself got into deep water. A coalition between Mama, left, and Crumb against Nikki, right. If Nikki had thrown himself wholeheartedly into his struggle with the females, that is, if he had used his dangerous teeth, he would definitely have forced them into submission earlier. As it was, he abided strictly by the rules, fighting only with his hands and feet, and never biting with his canines. Males sometimes do bite females, but only with their incisors. The females, who do not have large canines, are far less wary of using their teeth, both in fights with other females and when defending themselves against male aggressors. Because of these rules, the weeks of conflict between Nikki and the females showed no definite outcome either way, nor was there any serious fighting, because Nikki was agile enough to avoid being caught. Time and again he provoked the females, and when they screamed in protest he waited to see how near they dared to get to him. If they got too close they knew they would receive a slap. If, on the other hand, the females outnumbered him, then Nikki would leap agilely out of the way. Despite Nikki's strength and the females' indignation, their confrontations never led to any injuries. The fact that such spectacular dominance processes can take place in a large colony without bloodshed justifies the optimism with which the Arnhem project was started. And at the same time it undermines the argument of zoo and laboratory managements that chimpanzees must be kept isolated, or at most in very small groups, because of their so-called extreme aggressiveness. Male chimpanzees are incredibly strong and they have the power to kill, but they are also capable of containing themselves. Nikki had to all intents and purposes a knife in his pocket, but nevertheless fought the females with his bare hands. The use of the canines remains restricted to the rare times when males fight among themselves, and even then chimpanzees are usually governed by a strict code of behavior. Over several months Nikki's confrontations with the females gradually decreased as more and more females began to greet him. The last females to acknowledge his new position were Mama and Pewist. They did not greet Nikki until October. From that time on Nikki ranked above all the females. He achieved his new status not merely because of his rapidly increasing physical strength. Nikki grew explosively in 1975 and 1976, but also thanks to the chaotic situation within the group. The females had no one to turn to. The group had no leader, and moreover Nikki invited conflicts at times when the two candidates for the leadership were busy confronting each other high up in the trees. The great advantage that Lewitt gained from Nikki's actions was perhaps only a byproduct as far as Nikki himself was concerned. Nikki and Lewitt did not have identical, but parallel interests. Lewitt's bid for power was probably made easier by the struggle for dominance between Nikki and the females and vice versa. Because their collaboration was obvious and yet their fields of action were so different, I have called their coalition an open coalition. The only instances of more direct collaboration between Lewitt and Nikki were after Yerowan had been virtually isolated within the group. By this time, when there was a conflict between Yerowan and Lewitt, Nikki accompanied them in the role of court jester. He did not actually participate in the conflict, but watched from the sidelines, running to and fro, turning somersaults and generally encouraging Lewitt from a distance. He hooted when Lewitt hooted at Yerowan, and sometimes he would chuck objects at Yerowan when he nervously tried to avoid Lewitt's advances, yelping as he did so. It was as if Nikki were amusing himself at Yerowan's expense. Tantrums and fights. It may seem as if during the summer of 1976 the chimpanzees did nothing but fight. This impression is wrong. The incidents described were highlights in a torpid season. For hours on end the chimpanzees would sit or loll about in the sun, barely able to keep their eyes open. Occasionally a few apes might lumber slowly around the enclosure, or groom each other quietly in the shade. But despite their apparent lassitude the chimpanzees never forgot what was afoot. Whenever Lewitt sleepily got up to take stock and happened to notice that Yerowan had sought the company of a female while he had been asleep, we immediately focused the video camera on him, ready for action. 3 or 4 times a day all hell broke loose. It is these moments I have recorded, not the remaining hours of deep peace and ostensible harmony. The period of struggle for dominance between Lewitt and Yerowan was a tense, but exciting one for us. It was a process full of twists and turns. For the first month, it was not clear what the final outcome would be. Some days Yeroen seemed to be in control, bluffing Liwet aside or chasing him away, assisted by the females. On other days it was Liwet who had the upper hand. He displayed forcefully at Yeroen and never bared his teeth once during confrontations with his rival. Yeroen, on the other hand, did bare his teeth, a sign of uncertainty among chimpanzees. In the early stages it seemed as if Yeroen were trying to hide this uncertainty from Liwet. Without any definite expression on his face, Yeroen would move away from his challenger and would only grin or utter a soft yelp when he was far enough away and had his back turned to Liwet. This fascinating spectacle of keeping up appearances was even more obvious in later dominance processes. Another phenomenon, which was also seen in later processes, and which I have come to interpret as the beginning of the end, is the losing party's temper tantrums. Yeroen began to have tantrums after the conflict had been raging for about a month. With an unerring sense of drama, he would let himself drop out of a tree like a rotten apple and roll around on the ground screaming and kicking, while all the time Liwet was displaying these hysterical outbursts gave an impression of scarcely suppressed despair and abjectness. When he had regained some of his self-composure, Yeroen would run yelping to the females, throw himself down on the ground a few meters away, and stretch out both hands to them. This was not a begging gesture, but a beseeching gesture, beseeching them for their support. If the females refused to help, or even went out of their way to avoid him, Yeroen would once again break down and have a tantrum. He seemed to lose all control of his muscles, screamed pitifully, and writhed around like a fish on dry land. His reaction was very different if the females did offer their support. Then he would leap up immediately, embrace them, and turn on his rival with the females close behind him. But as time went on, the females became less and less willing to help Yeroen, which was hardly surprising in view of Nicky's hard-handed interventions. As his sense of powerlessness increased in the face of Liwet's challenges, so did Yeroen's tantrums. It was as if Yeroen were trying to arouse pity and mobilize his sympathizers against Liwet. Familiarity, however, breeds contempt. In time Yeroen's tantrums became commonplace and predictable, and the other apes ceased to take any notice. The same was true of us. To begin with, we stood rooted to the spot, full of pity for Yeroen's inconsolable despair. But in time we became more laconic. We found it difficult to take Yeroen's despair completely seriously. It seemed so exaggerated and posed. Yeroen stopped having frequent temper tantrums once he had lost virtually all support. After a confrontation with Liwet, he no longer uttered heartrending screams, but sat staring at nothing in particular. The stuffing had been knocked out of him. Waal embraces Yeroen in an attempt to comfort him during one of Yeroen's many temper tantrums. The interesting thing about the temper tantrums was that Yeroen, at the ripe old age of 30, attempted to attract attention and arouse sympathy by lapsing into childlike, or rather childish, behavior. Tantrums are normally associated with infants when they are being weaned. Children feel that their mother is rejecting them and scream and kick until she draws them to her again. It is surprising and suspicious how abruptly children snap out of their tantrums if their mother gives in. It may well be that Yeroen displayed the same kind of behavior because he felt frustrated and threatened by Liwet's campaign to dethrone him. Yeroen was, as it were, being weaned from power. Yeroen's slow fall from dominance was reflected in his most serious clashes with Liwet. I have already mentioned their two fights in their sleeping quarters, both of which were won hands down by Liwet. If we call the day the struggle for dominance broke out day O, then the night fights occurred on the 3th and 59th nights. Other serious incidents were also observed during the day. These are described below. For the purpose of orientation, I regard the dominance process as having come to an end on the 72nd day, when Yeroen greeted Liwet for the first time. Day I6. In the first physical fight between the two males, Yeroen is the attacker. In reaction to Liwet's provocative displays, Yeroen, helped by Gorilla, chases after Liwet and catches him. Liwet tries to break loose, but finds himself surrounded by enemies. At least 8 individuals are involved in the fight. Before Liwet finally flees up a tree, Yeroen succeeds in biting him one last time. Liwet does not bite back at all. Day 24. Once again Yeroen is the aggressor, provoked by Liwet's displays. Together with Gorilla and Puist, Yeroen chases Liwet at full speed, screaming as he runs. Liwet is also screaming. Just when Yeroen succeeds in catching up with Liwet, Yeroen accidentally goes head over heels. After this the chase continues, but ends abruptly when both males flee up a tree and the two females do not follow. This is not altogether surprising because the tree the males have chosen is a live one, protected by high-voltage electricity. The conflict has become so intense that the males have dared to brave the electric shocks. While the two rivals sit up in the tree, the whole group gathers down below to gaze at this amazing spectacle. Yeroen is the first to jump down and is comforted by several of the group. They kiss and embrace him, and some of them put their fingers in his mouth. Yeroen repeatedly invites Liwet to come down. His invitations are accompanied by a whole scale of gestures. From holding out his hand and pouting his lips, right up to sexual advances, Liwet and Nicky also have erections. But Liwet remains in the tree and breaks off a number of branches, which he throws down. The other members of the group pick them up and start to eat the leaves. Several times Liwet hangs, just above Yeroen's head, balancing on a few thin branches, and holds out his hand to him. It is 3/4 of an hour before Liwet finally descends, with his arms full of broken branches. While the other members of the group gather greedily around the food Liwet has brought down with him, Yeroen follows Liwet to another part of the enclosure where they are quietly reconciled. Once they are friends again, the two groom each other for a considerable time, and then settle down, in brotherly fashion, to feast on the sizable branch Yeroen has been holding all along. This dramatic event had far-reaching consequences, because from that day on the apes' interest in the live beech trees greatly increased. The next day Liwet was seen sitting under the same tree on several occasions, looking up at it, although he did not venture to climb up again. 4 days later the apes had solved the problem of the electric wires by placing a long branch against the tree as a sort of ladder. This method was later used more frequently and developed into a speciality of Liwet's and Nicky's. Yeroen never showed any initiative in that direction. It may have been accidental that Liwet played Santa Claus on that first and later occasions, strewing food around for the masses, but to me it immediately looked as if he had hit on a very clever way of drawing attention to himself. Day 36. Another attack by Yeroen after repeated provocation by Liwet. Yeroen corners Liwet in the top of one of the dead trees and bites him. This time Liwet bites back. Mama, Gorilla, Puist, and Nicky also play a role in the confrontation. Only Puist actually joins in the fighting, though unfortunately it is not clear whose side she is on. Almost immediately after they have all descended from the tree, Yeroen bluffs over Liwet. The two males then kiss each other and lick each other's wounds. Liwet's wounds are clearly deeper. Yeroen holds out a hand to Liwet, inviting him to come out of a live tree after a conflict between them. Left to right, Dandy, Nicky, and Spin looking on. Puist is sitting on the right, and on the wall Mama, left, is trying to get some leaves from her friend Gorilla. Later on Liwet threw more leaves out of the tree, enough for everyone. The incident had one repercussion that is worth mentioning in connection with Mama's possible role as the leader of the female support for Yerowan. When the skirmish in the tree had come to an end and everyone was back on the ground, Mama made a beeline for Jimmy, who hastily grabbed her child and fled from Mama, screaming loudly. At the same time, Mama's friend and ally, Gorilla, attacked Crom. The reason for these two sudden attacks must have lain in the preceding conflict between the two males, but Jimmy and Crom had nothing to do with the conflict. Perhaps their neutrality was Mama's reason. We shall never know for certain, but it was not the only time that the main conflict between Yerowan and Lewitt had repercussions among the females. Day 64. The final serious fight takes place after Lewitt has been following Yerowan for a time and has pelted him with stones. Yerowan flees screaming, but then suddenly stops short and turns to fight Lewitt. Pewist runs up to the fighting males and throws herself into the fray. Once again, it is not clear whose side she supports. It seems most likely that she is against Yerowan, because immediately after Pewist joins in, Yerowan disentangles himself from the melee and flees screaming to Mama. Lewitt pursues him, but together with Mama, Yerowan is able to fight him off. When things have settled down again, Pewist comes over to Mama and greets her submissively. Yerowan and Lewitt do not reconcile their differences for a good half hour. This time Yerowan has been wounded but Lewitt has not. We never saw wounds on either Yerowan or Lewitt other than after the 2 fights in the sleeping quarters and the 3 fights in the group. We can therefore safely assume that the 2 rivals had only 5 serious confrontations. The 3 fights in the group, which I have just described, show an obvious turnabout. In the first fight Yerowan was the attacker and winner, and his opponent did not bite back. In the second fight Lewitt did bite back. In the third and final fight Lewitt was the attacker and winner. In view of the fact that these 3 fights took place within a few weeks of each other, an explanation cannot be sought in a change in the physical powers of the 2 males. The outcomes in fact reflect the change in the relative social status. We tend to think that the outcome of a fight determines the social relationship, whereas here the outcome was determined by the social relationship. The same was seen in later dominance processes. The prevailing social climate affected the self-confidence of the rivals. It was as if their effectiveness depended on the attitude of the group, rather like a soccer team playing better at home than away. Although after 4 weeks Lewitt had shown in the fight in the sleeping quarters that he was physically stronger than Yerowan, it took him 9 weeks to prove himself as convincingly in the group as a whole. By then Yerowan could hardly hope for any support, and one of the females, Pewist, had probably deserted his camp altogether. Lewitt had carefully tested the reactions of the group before he dared make an overt attack on Yerowan. His success in the final fight was more than just a demonstration of brute strength. He made it quite clear to Yerowan that the attitude of the group had changed radically. I cannot believe that fights between males are in fact tests of strength, because the males are too controlled. They only bite extremities, usually a finger or a foot, and less frequently a shoulder or the head. This special kind of controlled fighting is already obvious between 2 juvenile males, Waal and Jonas, both in their play, and during the rare serious incidents between them. Since this is virtually the only way the males fight each other, they cannot be out to prove their respective physical strengths. The crucial factor is their capacity to fight effectively within the rules. A male must be able to get his hands and feet quickly out of the way, and he must equally quickly be able to seize hold of his opponent's hand or foot. Speed and agility are just as important as strength. The inhibitions and rules governing male-male confrontations in chimpanzees are characteristic of species with multi-male societies. This condition is far from common. Social mammals usually live in groups of several, sometimes many, females, but few adult males. In some species, such as elephants, males are not really part of society at all, whereas in most other species a single male keeps rivals away from his females. Less commonly, males tolerate each other's presence, usually with little friendly contact among them, and the rarest situation of all is that males are actually friends and allies. The other 3 great ape species are typical, ranging from intolerance among adult males to tense, but rather uncooperative relationships. Male orangutans roam vast territories in the rainforest to ward off other males. Gorilla males sometimes live in the same group, but typically monopolize females and fight off intruders to the death. Bonobo males do live together, but are highly competitive. They do not hunt together as do male chimpanzees, nor do they defend a territory together or form political alliances. Bonobo males, including fully grown ones, follow their mothers around through the forest and depend on her for status. Sons of high-ranking mothers tend to be at the top. Bonobo society is female-bonded and female-dominated, which is fascinating by itself, but makes it a poor model for the complex male-male relations that characterize our own societies. The outside enclosure at Arnhem Zoo is approximately 2 acres of forest surrounded by a moat. 2/3 of the island is visible here. To demonstrate our unique feeding experiment to zoo visitors and television crews, we arranged feeding sessions with reversed roles between human and ape. Instead of the ape in the cage and the human outside, here we have Monica protected by a cage trying to get Gorilla, who is holding Rusha, to pay attention to the procedures. Mama, the group's matriarch. At the age of 8 weeks, Rusha was still in human hands. Opposite, Nikki at the age of 18 years. Yerowan, the oldest male, was the leader during the early years. Long thereafter, he remained a power to be reckoned with. Yerowan, right, presents himself with spread legs to Franja, who ignores his advances. Swat, right, watches as Jonas fishes for food in the moat. Wouter, left, and Jonas, both 5 years old, tickling each other with play faces. Opposite, young chimpanzees have a light-colored face that later often turns dark. Swat with her 1-year-old daughter, Zola. During the brief period of Lewitt's leadership, Nikki, left, bows for him. Even though Lewitt, with his hair erect, looks larger, both males are approximately the same size. Preceding pages, males usually use only their hands and feet when fighting females. Spin, right, protests at having been slapped by Lewitt. His slaps were so hard that she turned head over heels several times in the sand. A coalition of 4 aggressors united against a bluffing and sidestepping dandy. Left to right, Yerowan, Gorilla, Mama, Wouter, and Dandy. Nikki engages in a bluff display with hooting. This is the usual way social climbers announce their aspirations. A mouth-to-mouth kiss between Nikki, center, left, and Henny seals their reconciliation after an attack by Nikki. Mama, left, and Dandy, right, look on. Reconciliations among adult males depend on who is the first to make a move. Nikki holds out a hand to Lewitt about 10 minutes after their conflict ended in the tree. Just after this photograph was taken, the males embraced each other and climbed down together. Yerowan and Nikki demonstrate their bond. Yerowan, front, is mounted and embraced from behind by Nikki, while both scream at their common rival, Lewitt, who is not in the picture. In the summer of 1997, one returned to the Arnhem colony to collect photographic updates on some of the book's main characters. Jambo's appearance came as a complete surprise. His hair color is a mixture of brown and grey, which makes him stand out among all other chimpanzees in the colony. His mother, Gorilla, is as black as a chimpanzee can be, and none of the potential fathers looks like him. Opposite, after a long and eventful life, Mama is old and looks it. Despite her rapidly deteriorating health, she remains the most influential female. Compare this photograph of Zola at the age of 18 with the one taken when she was only 1 year old, page 7 in photo gallery. Now Zola is as dark as her mother, Swat, whose name means black. Teppel are right, with her 11-year-old daughter, Tessua. Male chimpanzees stand alone among our closest relatives in their ability to overcome the basic competitive tendencies found among all male animals, and to achieve a high degree of cooperation. In the same way that many human males engage in continuous office rivalries while maintaining unity against corporate enemies, chimpanzee males contain and ritualize their competitiveness because of the need to form a common front against their neighbors. Even if neighbor groups are absent in Arnhem, the chimpanzee male psyche, shaped by millions of years of intergroup warfare in the natural habitat, is one of both competition and compromise. Whatever the level of competition among them, males count on each other against the outside. No male ever knows when he will need his greatest foe. It is, of course, this mixture of camaraderie and rivalry among males that makes chimpanzee society so much more recognizable to us than the social structure of the other great apes ate. The price of peace. Because the 5 serious fights were so sensational, we perhaps tend to attach too much importance to them. In between these fights, literally hundreds of displays and non-violent conflicts took place. The fights dramatically demonstrated the state of affairs, but this was ultimately determined by a complex series of factors that were reflected in innumerable and interminable social maneuvers. Offset against the few serious outbreaks of aggression between Yerowan and Lewitt is the vast amount of time and energy they devoted to suppressing it. At least that is the most likely function of the many friendly contacts and long grooming sessions between the two rivals. Males tend to groom each other during periods of tension, a fact which is excellently illustrated on the graphs we plotted of the apes' grooming activities over the years. Grooming peaks between pairs of males coincided with periods during which the relationship between them was unstable. The record during one of the dominance processes was almost 20%. In other words, despite all their confrontations, the two rivals spent about 1/5 of their time grooming each other. Yerowan and Lewitt did not groom each other as much as that, but their grooming activity was far higher than usual. Despite the fact that grooming appears to be a highly relaxed activity, it seems reasonable to assert that when males begin to groom each other more regularly, it is a sign of friction. I emphasize the word males, because it is not certain that this rule also applies to female chimpanzees. A grooming session generally takes place shortly after a reconciliation. To begin with, the reconciliations between Yerowan and Lewitt baffled us, because the two males would sit facing each other with their hair on end as if they were about to display again. The first afternoon, I watched this with a mixture of fright and amazement, but later I learned the difference between display behavior that leads to friendly contact and normal displays that aggravate the conflict. During reconciliation, both individuals are always unarmed, no sticks or stones in their hands, and there is eye contact. Chimpanzee males avoid looking at each other in moments of tension, challenge, and intimidation. In moments of reconciliation, on the other hand, they look each other straight and deep in the eyes. After a conflict, the former opponents may sometimes sit opposite each other for a quarter of an hour or more, trying to catch each other's eye. Once the opponents are finally looking at each other, first hesitantly, but then more steadily, the reconciliation will not be far away. Apart from the many scenes of reconciliation between Yerowan and Lewitt, we also witnessed truces. At least I can think of no better explanation for the long, intensive contacts between them just before they retired to their sleeping quarters in the evening. They never came into their cage and reconciled, and the fact that they had only 2 night fights may well be due to these truces. To illustrate this more clearly, let me describe one of these evening handshakes at the door. Day is 5 p.m. All the apes are inside except Yerowan and Lewitt, who are by the entrance. Lewitt is displaying slightly a little way away from Yerowan. Yerowan moves closer to Lewitt and pants at him. He holds out his hand and grins. Lewitt grins back, but keeps his distance. With huge steps and hair on end, Lewitt paces around Yerowan a few times, while Yerowan is still begging for contact. Lewitt takes a few steps toward Yerowan, but then slowly backs away again. While he is backing still further away, Lewitt keeps on grinning at Yerowan, and at the same time he has an erection. About 20 meters away from Yerowan, Lewitt lies down on his belly and makes pelvic thrusts into the sand, panting all the while. Yerowan approaches him hesitantly. Quite unexpectedly, both apes begin to scream at exactly the same moment, and Lewitt presents himself to Yerowan, who begins to groom Lewitt's backside, panting heavily as he does so. After a few minutes, the two of them sit down and proceed to groom each other for a long time. An hour later, they wander into the building. The other apes have already eaten. The keeper and I have waited patiently until the two males had calmed down sufficiently to enter their sleeping quarters together. They both eat heartily. These reconciliations and truces between Yerowan and Lewitt were not automatic. It was more that their sense of honor seemed to be at stake. If neither one was prepared to make the first conciliatory move by looking at the other, holding out a hand, panting in a friendly way, or simply going up to his opponent, the two would continue to sit tensely opposite each other, and it was frequently a third party who helped them out of the impasse. This third party was always one of the adult females. Female mediation might take any number of forms. On the first day, for example, Crom was a party to the reconciliation I have described between Lewitt and Yerowan. She groomed them in turn, but her role was not yet decisive enough to be called a genuine attempt at mediation, of which there were many obvious instances later. After the conflict between the two rivals had died down, the female mediator would walk up to one of them and kiss him or groom him for a short time. After she had presented herself to him, and he had inspected her genitals, she would walk slowly over to his opponent. The first male would follow her, sniffing at her vulva every now and again, and without looking at his opponent. The male's decided interest in the mediating females behind was unusual. In other situations, an adult male would not follow a female who had just presented herself to him, especially if she did not have a sexual swelling. In fact, females with a sexual swelling have never been seen to act as mediators. This is understandable, because they would only be a source of further disagreement. The male probably followed the female mediator as a kind of excuse to approach his opponent while at the same time not having to look at him. It was obvious that the female did not just happen to walk over to the opponent, her mediation was a purposeful act. She would regularly look around to make sure the first male was still following her, and if he was not, she would turn around and tug at his arm so as to make him follow. When she and the male reached his opponent, the female would sit down and both males would proceed to groom her, one on each side. When the female discreetly withdrew a few minutes later, the two males would continue grooming as if nothing had happened, but now, of course, they would be grooming each other. This surprising catalytic function of the females can only be interpreted as meaning that it was in their interest that peace should be restored. All the adult females performed the role of mediator at one time or another, but not all their methods were as subtle as in the incident described above. The most striking example I have ever seen was a more or less forced contact between Lewitt and Nikki. After the two of them had been in conflict, Pewis kept on jabbing Lewitt's side with her hand until he was sitting close to Nikki and had to choose between jumping away or moving still closer to his opponent. He chose the latter. Now that we have considered grooming, eye contact, truces, and mediation, the reasons for my intense interest in the whole subject of reconciliation may well be clear. I believe that the social significance of this behavior cannot be overemphasized. It almost certainly plays a crucial role as a constructive counterbalance to forces that threaten to disrupt the life of the group. It is amazing that so little research has been done into this aspect of behavior. In the 196 OS, and 19,705 vast sums were spent on research into aggressive behavior among humans and animals, but virtually nothing has been done on its resolution. I have kept one aspect of reconciliation until last because it is closely connected with the termination of the struggle between Yerowan and Lewitt. This is the phenomenon of joint displaying, by both parties, as an overture to reconciliation. It seems to have a very special significance, as a test of the state of the dominance relationship. Lewitt had not been greeting Yerowan for weeks, so there was no doubt about the way things were developing. In the absence of such submissive behavior, the emphasis came to rest on proving the opposite, dominance. Initially, only Yerowan adopted a dominant attitude at the end of a conflict. He did this before seeking reconciliation contact. When the two males approached each other, their hair on end, making themselves look as big as possible and looking each other straight in the eye, it was Yerowan who executed the bluff over. In other words, he stepped over Lewitt with his arm raised. Only then did the two mains kiss and groom each other or seek other forms of contact. Lewitt's attempts to reverse the dominance ritual made Yerowan extremely nervous. Yelping, he has walked away from his rival and now approaches Swart in search of reassurance. After a few weeks of frequent bluff-overs by Yerowan, an interim period dawned, during which the reconciliations hardly ever involved displays. Then, very gradually, Lewitt started to try bluff-overs himself. His attempts caused extreme tension in Yerowan. The first time Lewitt tried to reverse the roles, both males approached each other displaying and drawing themselves up to their full height, until they faced each other on two legs. Lewitt raised his arm to bluff over Yerowan, whereupon Yerowan ran away screaming and broke into a temper tantrum. It was not until the 49th day that Lewitt succeeded in bluffing over Yerowan for the first time. This later became the standard procedure, but the reversal was a very gradual process. For a number of weeks Yerowan and Lewitt bluffed over each other. They both tried to escape the role of the subservient, dominated party, and as a result sometimes put the process of reconciliation at risk. On one occasion Yerowan even exceeded all the unwritten rules governing such confrontations, by butting his head sharply against Lewitt's chest as the latter was stepping over him. Lewitt fled screaming in protest. On other occasions it was Lewitt who refused to be bluffed over. He backed away on his legs as Yerowan approached, whereupon Yerowan began to yelp and ran to the nearest member of the group, sought reassurance in a brief embrace, and then returned to Lewitt. In the last week of the whole process, Lewitt's increasingly dominant behavior was finally underlined by Yerowan's subservient behavior. Once again, this took place within the context of reconciliation. We observed a number of new developments. Attempts at contact at the end of a conflict were now only made on Yerowan's initiative. Lewitt regularly refused to have anything to do with Yerowan, which meant that Yerowan had to make several attempts before Lewitt was prepared to accept his overtures. At such moments Yerowan uttered sounds in Lewitt's direction that, although strongly reminiscent of greeting, were too soft and mumbled to counter such. At the time, I did not recognize the possible link between these three phenomena: the need for contact by the one party, refusal of contact by the other, and the mumbled greeting. It was not until I studied later processes that the explanation suddenly occurred to me. It was as if conciliatory overtures at this stage in a relationship could only be successful if coupled with this soft greeting. In this final phase, the losing party's need for contact is so great that the winning party can blackmail him. The winner refuses to have anything to do with the loser until he has received some respectful grunts. I have so often seen how greeting has paved the way for reconciliation with an initially unwilling dominant group member that I now firmly believe that for the contact seeker, it is a case of bend or break. If this interpretation sounds far-fetched, it is largely because we humans too readily believe that such behavior calls for cool, calculated thinking, but I am not so sure this is always the case. The intelligence and social awareness required to exercise emotional pressure on others can be subconscious. After all, human children can sometimes be dictators in the family from a very early age, without being rationally aware of what they are doing. As a result of this blackmail, the first vague greetings were directed at the new dominant male's back, because the latter would walk away and only stop and sit down when he heard the soft grunts. This phenomenon of greeting the opponent's back lasted between Yerowan and Lewitt until the 72nd day, when Yerowan uttered a series of clear grunts to Lewitt's face for the first time. I count this as the first real greeting, and as such it marked the end of the dominance process. From that time on, the number of conflicts and displays between Lewitt and Yerowan decreased drastically. Within a week the group was enjoying uncommon peace. 2 weeks later the former rivals were even playing with each other again, which they had not done for a good 3 months. And they were not the only ones. Nikki, Dandy, and even Mama, Pewist, and Jimmy frolicked around with playfaces. This was a very unusual sight, because adult females are seldom in such a playful mood. A stable hierarchy is a guarantee of peace and harmony in the group. And the figures back me up on this. From 1976 through 1978 there were a total of 37 serious fights between adult males, the majority of which, 22, took place in periods when the individuals involved were not greeting each other. These greetingless periods together made up less than a quarter of the total. This means that the risk of violence, however small in general terms, was almost 5 times as high when formal dominance relations were disrupted. These figures strengthen the assumption that greetings have a reassuring effect. They probably serve as a kind of insurance for the dominant male that his position is safe. A show of respect in the form of greeting, on the part of the loser in the dominance process, is the price he pays for a relaxed relationship with the winner. That was how Jeroen bought his peace from Lewitt at the end of 1976, and how the adult females bought their peace from Nikki. With the establishment of the new order, the group would almost certainly have entered a period of stability, had it not been for the fact that Jeroen's overthrow was far more than just a shift in the hierarchy. Jeroen's fall suddenly opened up brand new coalition possibilities, and chimpanzees, like politicians, never fail to recognize and seize such opportunities when they present themselves. Formation of the triangle. The growth of a plant is so gradual that it cannot be seen with the naked eye. But we can tell whether a plant is growing because we have learned to recognize the signs, such as half-open buds and young leaves.